All right. Good evening. I'd like to call the April 24th Planning Policy Commission meeting to order at 6:34 p.m. Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The Planning Policy Commission is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. Staff, do we have a quorum tonight?
Vice Chair Patterson, yes, you do. And Chair Voice is excused tonight, and Commissioner Millender-Irwin may be in traffic.
Excellent. And then thank you as well to Commissioner Moll for joining us online. All right, now we will move on to the minutes. So our first item of business is to take action to approve the minutes for the April 9th PPC meeting. Are there any corrections to the draft minutes provided in the agenda packet? All right, hearing none, the minutes are approved. The next item of business is public comment. For this meeting, we're holding general public comment at this time for all general topics being discussed by the commission. Staff, has anybody signed up to make a public comment?
No, sir, there are no public comments today.
All right. Excellent. If there are no public comments, then we will move on to our regular business for the evening. And that regular business this evening is the Title 18 Tree Code amendments. So Douglas Yormick, our environmental planner, will be presenting on this topic tonight. Doug, go ahead.
All right. Good evening, commissioners. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am in Chelan representing the city at a planning conference, so I am joining from my hotel room. Thank you, everyone. I'm the environmental planner with Community Planning and Development, and Stephen Padua is also with me to address any comments in person. Together, we're here to propose the amendments to Chapter 18.812, our Tree Preservation Code. So this meeting will introduce, I'm on the second slide, Stephen, the purpose. This meeting will introduce the amendments to the tree code our staff has been working on with our environmental consultant, Facet. Next slide. So a little bit of background. In May 2023, Council approved a major update to Title 18, the city's land use code. This included an overhaul of our tree preservation code. Since then, several changes were, as part of that, several changes were adopted as part of the overhaul. One such change was replacing tree density on individual lots with standard for tree canopy coverage to help implement the city's climate action goal of hitting 55% canopy coverage by 2035. Since this was adopted, staff have identified several areas for improvement for better clarity to interpret and apply the standards equitably and consistently. Council 2 has heard concerns from residents and have asked staff to prepare amendments to the tree code. Next slide. Thank you. So we have grouped our proposed amendments into 3 categories based on the type of change in the code. So we created a change matrix identifying these 3 categories and included that into your packet. Both clarifying and minor, we've gathered information from 100 plus tree removal permits and development activity and feedback from residents and stakeholders. Additionally, some came from other sources such as Washington state law, case law. Major represents a significant departure from our current code or policy questions brought up during review. It's this category that we're going to go more in depth during this presentation. Next slide. So these are the list of clarifying amendments. These amendments don't introduce any significant changes to the existing regulations. but instead seek to remove ambiguities, make rules easier to understand or apply. These changes do not have any policy questions to discuss. Next slide. And then these are the list of minor amendments that we've identified. And these amendments are intended to address specific issues or correct minor deficiencies that we've found in our code without making large-scale changes to the overall land use framework. Next slide. And then these three are identified as our major amendments. These amendments do propose policy level changes with the intent of still achieving our desired outcome of hitting our 55% target by 2035. It's these amendments we'll discuss in more detail. Next slide. So this is our current canopy targets that we approved back in 2023. Our current practice places the burden of meeting our canopy target goals on individual property owners without consideration for lot size or existing improvements on that lot. Instead, it more generalized using sub areas or neighborhoods capturing, in instances, capturing forested hillsides and open spaces within each sub area. While this approach created meaningful targets to achieve, it's difficult to administer on a lot by lot basis. So we heard from the community, from stakeholders, and the administration about pursuing another strategy without compromising our overall goal of hitting that 55% by 2035. Next slide. So we partnered with the environmental consulting firm Facet to develop a new strategy, taking into consideration feedback that we've received. This approach evaluated the existing canopy with land uses and potential planting areas, lot size, and zoning. Like those were taken into consideration when developing the new canopy targets. So instead of a strategy of applying the sub-areas canopy targets onto the individual property itself, we're proposing to create a specific canopy that's more targeted towards the land use or the intensity of the land use. And then for single family, we go a step further and even include lot size as a consideration. So these new targets are just one tool to achieve our goal of 55% by 2035. Another tool is the Urban Forest Management Plan developed by Parks, which looks at city-owned properties and facilities and trees within the right-of-way. So we should think of like taking together both of these as a comprehensive approach should still allow us to achieve our intended target of 55%. And reduce heat island effects and stormwater mitigation in a rapidly changing world. So the targets that we currently have in Title 18 for the sub areas have been incorporated into the Urban Forest Management Plan. So those overall neighborhood targets aren't going away. We have a recommendation from Facet to periodically review our canopy coverage to ensure that we're on track, and then to adjust our approach as necessary. So CP&D staff are communicating with Parks about this approach and its frequency. And then also say, in doing this update, we did look at other jurisdictions' tree preservation codes, and according to 2024 King County Guide to Developing Urban Tree Regulations, for blanking on the full name, 2024 King County Guide to Developing Effective tree regulations on private property. I think I got it all. And in it, they identified Issaquah as rated a level 4 out of 4, which is the highest, meaning we take a comprehensive approach to tree protection. And then even when compared to the other jurisdictions that have the same rating as us, we have a higher individual canopy target. All right, next slide. So the next couple of slides, I put together some case studies. This is a townhome development in the Tallis neighborhood. And as many of you are aware, the Tallis neighborhood, the lots within Tallis neighborhood tend to be very small when compared to other neighborhoods. This was purposeful to cluster developments and to maintain abundant open space. What this image doesn't really show are the additional improvements that are on the site, such as driveways and walkways, which take up additional potential planting area. So when looking at these lots, there's little opportunity for tree canopy. So the target in Tallis neighborhood was 75%. So achieving 75% is almost impossible for most lots in Tallis. There isn't much potential planting area to plant on these lots, since most have the home and the necessary improvements on a very small space. Pretty much, and then you have forested open spaces as well. So there isn't potential for off-site tree plantings within Tallis, and currently right-of-way trees. The canopies extend onto the individual lots, don't contribute to the tree canopy coverage for that individual lot. So by implementing a canopy coverage for the individual lot of 25%, which is what we're proposing for a single family lot of this size, is feasible for most within the sub area. This allows for easier implementation of the canopy requirements, and it's also proportionate and equitable for the property owner. Next slide. This is another case study. This was a single family addition in the Old Town neighborhood. The lot size is 9,688 square feet. It has an existing canopy coverage of 1,922. No trees were proposed to be removed with this addition. Under the current regulations, the Old Town sub-area has a 33% canopy coverage, meaning that the applicant would have to plant 1,275 square feet of canopy cover. Under the new method, for a single family lot of this size, the proposed canopy coverage is 35%. So in this instance, the applicant would have to plant more on this lot. So as for single family, as lot size increases, the requirement increases and vice versa. All right, next slide. So our thresholds to comply and how we calculate canopy coverage are proposed to be changed. Under both the current and proposed, all new and redevelopment must comply. However, the current method can be problematic, especially for small sites. Going back to the Tallis example, each of the townhome lots would require 75% canopy coverage. For such a small site with almost maximum impervious surface, this can be impossible. Under the revised method, the lot must comply with the new canopy targets. So going back to the Tallis example, it would be 25% of the lot would require canopy coverage. Additionally, the site abuts green space with potential for overhanging canopy. So when reviewing a tree removal permit or a new or redevelopment, this overhanging canopy can be captured for the canopy coverage for that lot. Staff felt that overhanging canopy should be considered, since that canopy theoretically should remain, since we only allow tree removal that's qualified, and that's when a tree is dead, dying, diseased, has been deemed hazardous or is a nuisance, which is causing obvious physical damage or has the potential to. Another change is if an individual lot is meeting the tree canopy targets, replacement trees won't be necessary. So our current method imposes property owners with a qualifying tree removal full canopy coverage requirements. Often this results in a single tree being removed, but the property owner having to plant several trees, adding costs, and without considering the land use or property size. This results in a property owner sometimes having to pay thousands of dollars in additional costs for just removing a single tree. This method isn't proportionate to the action being taken and can be punitive for the property owner. Next slide. And another major change is to reintroduce some flexibility to the central Issaquah neighborhood. So the sub-area is targeted for growth with urban densities and intensities, and in most locations, this will be infill development. So currently, the tree retention requirements for central Issaquah is 25% of the total caliper inches of within the developable site area. And the developable site area is the area defined anywhere outside of critical areas in their buffers or exclusively used easements. Currently, we have no remedy to reduce this requirement without going through the variance process. And as you go through the variance criteria, a reduction in the tree retention wouldn't be supported. Since most of the projects in Central will be infill developments, of the infill development of existing suburban style development, many of the trees that are existing on site tend to be parking lot trees or maybe perimeter landscape trees. And in some instances, these are poorly maintained and just not the right tree in the right spot. May not survive any sort of development that occurs. So by reintroducing some flexibility, we can continue to target growth into Central. Review would occur under the land use permit with an accompanied arborist report. And to qualify for the deviation, the applicant must meet the criteria for the retention, the deviation from the retention. And anything below 25% retention will be required to pay into the tree fund. And then in all cases, the development must meet the proposed canopy coverage targets. And then next slide. So this is another case study example that I pulled up from Central Issaquah. As you can see, this is existing office building. This is being proposed. This is a proposed redevelopment. It'll be a residential development. And currently, the applicant would have to save or retain 25% of the trees in the developable site area. And as you can see, most are parking lot trees, and there's some perimeter landscape trees. So I'm just using this as an example to show kind of what we're looking at in Central. And so the flexibility would allow a reduction to that 25% tree retention. And then once the site has been developed, they would have to demonstrate that they're going to meet their 20-year canopy targets. And we would review that during permit review. Next slide. So earlier this month, we had an introduction kickoff meeting with the environmental board. And these are the 7 items in which we identified to bring up for further consideration and review. Next slide.
Before we move on, Doug, I'm going to invite 2 environmental board members to kind of speak on the board feedback.
Okay.
Don, did you want to go through the list?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just kind of share some high-level thoughts from what the environmental board thought. So I'm Don McWilliams. I'm the chair of the environmental board, for those of you that don't know me. So there was there was a lot of talk about wildfires on the environmental board at the meeting, and we had some concerns about down trees, dead trees, hazardous trees that could be inside the burn zone and be subject to this code if people were have to get permits to take those down. We recommended that we do some piloting with this code to kind of see what it would look like. So like the scenario that we just saw there, but do some more of those so we could get a better look at it. On the multi-family targeting, we found it difficult to site trees adjacent to those multifamily lots and on those lots. I know there's a fee in lieu program for that, but kind of the idea is we want to keep those trees, kind of in the neighborhood if possible. And there was talk from a citizen about her HOA and having a lot of issues trying to get a tree permit for multiple trees within the HOA. So they had several trees that were hazard trees in the HOA, and they had to get standalone permits for each one. So we had asked that staff look into that. More flexibility in the planting area. And then we wanted some clarification on the tree fund. We understand it's going to the tree fund, but we want to know exactly, where is the tree fund? Is it a dedicated fund? How is it used? So some more details there. And then with regard to the downtown effect, we were concerned about Heat Island. If we pull all the trees and, allow the developers just to put the trees around the perimeters or into little pockets, you could have potential Heat Island effect downtown.
Great, thank you, Don. Commissioners, before we let Don go, is there any questions about some of the comments from the environmental board that you want any clarity on?
Go ahead, Commissioner Adair.
Hi, could I have some clarification on the wildfire, what they would kind of hope for? Basically, would the idea be that people who could remove down trees without permits that were already down, is that the idea?
It wasn't so much, down trees, yes, being able to cut those up, move them out of the way, but it was more focused on, if you have potentially fire fuel trees within, if they could fall on your house, that are diseased, that are dying, that probably should be removed, finding a easier way to permit those trees rather than a standalone, tree by tree permit, being able to have an arborist come in and do kind of a full site evaluation rather than, taking one tree at a time type thing. And that came from one of our board members who's very, very concerned about wildfires. She lives up on the hill on the south side.
And Commissioner Mole, I see your hand up if you'd like to go ahead and ask.
Yes. Is there any plan to identify those trees that are dead and create fuel? I bring this up because I happen to own a lot in Sycamore that I just have never paid attention to. And it was pointed out to me by somebody who lived nearby that I had a dead 100-foot tree on that lot. And because I am because I am not in Issaquah all the time. And no one had told me. We took the tree out, but the tree was absolutely stone dead. And I didn't know. So what are we doing about absentee owners to identify dead trees and perhaps send them a notice that maybe they should take it down?
I can take a stab at responding to that, Commissioner Mole. So one of the things that we're doing as part of this process with the feedback that we got from the Environmental Board is we're connecting with Eastside Fire and Rescue. They conduct home emergency assessment for homeowners. And part of what they look at is wildfire risk to homes. And some of the recommendations oftentimes is pruning of trees or getting rid of any brush that could be used as fuel if there is any risk of wildfire. And so one of the things we're looking at is what's in those reports. Is that something that could be used in place of an arborist report to allow for pruning of trees on a property? To your question, Commissioner Mole, in terms of who's responsible for that. Right now, the responsibility is on the property owners. I don't know of any other process of being able to identify that otherwise, but that could be one of the questions we pose to Eastside Fire and Rescue as we're having the conversation with them.
I think that would be appropriate. In this case, there was no home on the property. There is no home on the property. So I am in effect an absentee owner.
Got it.
And I'm thinking that there are multiple properties around the city of Issaquah that have absentee owners who may or may not be aware of the condition of a tree. And we had the same thing in a lot across on a lot near the house that we own in Sycamore. And these are not small trees. These are like, oh my God, big trees. And I don't know that owner was ever informed that the tree was dead.
We'll pose some of those questions to Eastside Fire and Rescue and get back to the commission on that.
That would be great.
I did want to say from personal experience, it is the property owner's responsibility to look at those trees. I work at I work with my HOA to have an arborist come in once a year at spring to look at all the trees to see if any are dead. Because when insurance policies come, if your tree falls, you're responsible. So the homeowner is ultimately responsible for maintaining or the health of their trees, or to review to see if their trees are healthy.
Actually, when we discovered the problem, I asked my daughter, who's a real estate attorney, if that was in fact the case. And it's not as clear as you're making it sound when it comes to insurance. So it depends on if the owner should have known that tree had the potential to be a hazard, because you might have a tree that is not a hazard to an adjoining house, but is in fact a hazard to the community itself.
So we'll connect with Eastside Fire and Rescue about some of this topic and get back to the commission about what their feedback is.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen. Any questions for the Environmental Board Chair before we move on?
I had a comment in regards to the discussion we just had about Eastside Fire and Rescue, and I do have some experience with the fire risk mitigation report that they will produce after doing an inspection of an owner's lot. And as an HOA manager, when some properties are developed, developers want to give the look and feel that our property has been there forever. And one of the ways of doing that is to plant a lot of trees. And over the years, as these small trees get bigger, the placement of those trees become problematic, and they will usually pull attention in terms of either insurance companies looking at them and deeming them either a fire risk because they're too close to the structure, overhanging a roof, and deemed to be either a fire hazard or just an overall hazard. The recommendations that I've seen in those fire risk mitigation reports from Eastside Fire and Rescue indicate that the trees need to be removed. So in the particular property that I manage, that would represent a reduction in the tree canopy. But in this case, we're overplanted. And so what is an HOA that is effectively overplanted and is needing to, I guess, comply with fire risk mitigation recommendations to do in this particular case?
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Millender-Irwin. Any other questions or comments for our Environmental Board Chair, Nick Williams? Yes, Commissioner Adair.
Hi, if you could just go into more detail on number 5 for identify planning areas with flexibility. I didn't quite hear that, so if you could expand a little more, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, Stephen and Doug, maybe you can help me with this one. I don't remember this entire conversation. I think it was around the multifamily homes and the need to kind of have some set-aside areas that could be used as future planting areas. Was that where that conversation was going? It was. I recall that there was concerns that we would have to be installing trees in people's backyards that would end up, getting in between the houses, and then when we're fully grown, they'd be a full canopy over the backyard, make it unusable. It'd be difficult, and then people would end up just cutting those trees down. So, does that sound familiar?
It was part of that conversation. It was also part of the conversation where you have sites that have maximized their impervious surface, and so there's no plantable area. And so having an alternative places identified in other places of the city, particularly public spaces. This is a conversation we're having with Dan Hintz, our urban forester, who's joined us tonight, as part of his implementation of the urban forestry management plan and program. Part of his job is helping identify some of those alternative planting areas throughout the city. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Hey guys, I think we covered it. Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Hintz, Urban Forest Supervisor with our Parks and Community Services Department. And yeah, this has been really kind of ad hoc and formal when there's been a need for off-site tree replacements, working with our Parks Department to find locations. I think this has been a goal identified in our urban forest management plan that Stephen and Doug have referenced to formalize that kind of essentially receiving sites for, some of these areas where you can't meet the canopy targets on the developed property. So that's a process I want to work on with community planning to make sure we kind of have that set up, identified, throughout the different sub areas in the city.
Commissioner Dürr, does that help answer your question?
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments for Chair McWilliams? Go ahead, Commissioner Mole. Oh, you're on mute.
Commissioner Mole, you are.
There we go.
Okay, you should be unmuted
Unmuted
now.
me now?
Yes.
Am I unmuted? Okay. Is there any discussion about ways to compensate owners who donate property, who have sites that don't have a lot of trees and who are willing to make those sites, this is individual homeowners, make those sites available to the general community for planting? I'm saying that because I own some lot. I mean, my father planted 1,000 trees around Issaquah. He was instrumental in making sure that we increased tree canopy. And I have lots of trees on my own home. And I would be willing to make property that I have available for tree planting, which would help with the canopy. Is there any discussion about those, identifying those lots that have very little tree coverage and where the owners would be willing to provide, to allow for planting? Has there been any discussion about that?
Dan, I can let you speak to that more. You're involved in more of those discussions if you're able.
Yeah, Ellen, that's a really great question. I don't think there's been specific discussions kind of at the kind of single property or single family kind of level. We've talked about that a little bit with some of our bigger HOAs that might have potential receiving sites where we could do trees. So that would be, kind of working with them if they have developments in their HOAs and identifying sites that we could have tree replacements. So, I think we have the most, control and opportunities, obviously, with our public spaces and figuring out access agreements, things like that. The incentive idea is really interesting too. I mean, we'd have to figure out how that would work, but I think identifying sites like what you're describing is a very interesting idea. But I wouldn't say it's something we've discussed in much detail, other than kind of like some of the larger HOAs, maybe like Issaquah Highlands and Talus, trying to kind of identify some of those offsite receiving areas.
Have there been any discussions about allowing transfer? So, for example, if an owner has a major tree that needs to be removed, and that owner is fine with planting, but on a different lot, and with that, has there been any discussion about allowing that transferability?
Stephen, Doug, I might hand that back to you, but my understanding, I mean, if it's in, based on our current code, if it's in the same sub area, then, yes, we try to prefer on-site replacement first, off-site within the sub area. And then if we need to move to other sub areas, I think is kind of our order, but I would defer to Doug, like Doug's nodding, like I hopefully got that right. But, so yes, I'm not sure how often that happens. Like I said, I'm mostly managing public trees. So often it's, a different, public works transportation project needs to do some offsite trees. We'll identify spots in our park system that we can do that. But I'm not sure how much that's happening kind of private to private properties.
Yeah, all of us planners work on tree removal permits, so I can only really speak for what I know, the ones that I have reviewed, and just from discussions with the other planners, I don't think that happens. It would be allowed if you wanted to have an agreement with a neighbor or another property owner within that sub area to plant a tree. That would just be a neighbor to neighbor or resident to resident agreement. We wouldn't get in the way of that, and if they allow the planting to be there, we would ensure that the tree was planted with an inspection once it was in the ground. Yeah, so that would be allowed.
Okay, so that transferability would be allowed. The other thing is, for those areas that are damp, obviously you're going to plant trees whose roots do well in damp soil. But some of the regulations, the environmental regulations that identify wetlands, include trees. So if you plant a tree that's good for in damp soil conditions, that's used as an identifier for whether or not there's a wetlands on that. That a part of that property becomes wetlands. How are you guys identifying ways so that somebody can plant a tree and 30 years later they don't find out that they've created wetlands?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Yes, you're right. Vegetation is one of the criteria that's used to identify wetlands. In addition to that, you'd have to look at other indicators as well. One is soil. So does it have hydric soil or wetland type soils? And then you'd also have to look at hydrology too. So in order for it to be determined to be a wetland, it needs water within 12 inches of the surface for 2 weeks out of the growing year, which is enough time for it to produce hydric soils. If you don't have those requirements, even if it's damp, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a wetland. There's going to be other indicators that a wetlands biologist would go out and identify. And if that tree has, there's an indicator, and if it meets that indication, but the soils aren't hydric, then that's not a wetland.
I realized we had planted trees that were appropriate for damp soil at the time, and because the amount of water does not stay constant over 30 years, 40 years, those trees were used as wetlands identifiers, even though they were planted because they were appropriate to the site. Will the staff be dealing with that? I mean, can you register your tree so that if somebody plants a tree that is wetlands appropriate? Because the last thing you want is somebody planting a pear tree its roots tend to rot in wetlands.
Commissioner Moll, sorry, I'm going to jump in real quick. We actually have a comment in the room that will help address this scenario. I'll pass it to Stephen real quick.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it on to our sustainability manager who has some insight on this topic.
Thanks, Stephen. Stacy Van McKinstry, I'm the sustainability manager with the city and also the liaison to the environmental board, which is why I was here tonight. But I just wanted to speak briefly to the question around incentivizing tree plantings on private property. My role at the city is overseeing implementation of the city's climate action plan, and we actually have an action that explicitly says that. A couple of years ago, we looked into incentive programs for either maintaining or planting trees on private property. Many of the programs that exist are for much larger land than what we have within our city limits. And so a year ago, we worked with Dan's team and worked with the UW Evans School to look at options for incentivizing tree planting on private property. And the recommendation that came out of that project was a tree giveaway program. So we'll be piloting that, sustainability and Dan's program, Urban Forestry. We'll be piloting that program in the fall as one option, and then hopefully looking at other ways to expand incentivizing the tree plantings on private property. So just wanted to provide some of that context and share one of the programs that we'll be launching this fall as a pilot.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that information. Before, I know we probably have some more questions that we want to ask, but before we get into that, do we want to finish the presentation now? Is there any more information to cover?
This is pretty close to the end of the presentation, so if there's any other questions for our environmental board members, now's the time, otherwise we can let them go.
All right, so looking around one more time for questions to the environmental board folks who kindly joined us this evening. All right. Well, thanks to the environmental board for joining us and providing this feedback. Your knowledge and expertise on this topic is very important to the conversation, and I know helped us stay informed as well. So we can continue on.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So these are 4 policy questions that we have identified. We want to bring to your attention for discussion at the next Planning Policy Commission hearing on May 22nd. And these questions are included in your packet. Next slide. And then this is just a timeline for next steps through implementation. So we will be returning to the Environmental Board on May 14th, followed by Planning Policy Commission hearing on May 22nd. We'll go to the PDE Council Committee on June 10th, and we've tentatively scheduled July 7th as City Council adoption. And then next slide. And that's it. Do you have any questions?
Excellent. I am sure that we do. So I'll just ask our commissioners to please raise your hand and wait to be called on, and we'll try and give everyone an opportunity to speak before we kind of come back around. And I will start with Commissioner Kraft, please.
Hey, Doug, thank you for your work. This is Commissioner Kraft. 2 questions. The first has a couple parts, is on very small lots, because I know lot size, I think in where I live, you could do like 2,500 to 3,000 square foot lots. And I know you mentioned getting a 25% canopy. Do we know that that is very doable? Because that's still 750 feet. Once you have the building, the driveways, all the impervious surfaces, if there's any shrubs, is there much, do you have some examples? That's the first part of it, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then talk a little bit more about fee in lieu. So if someone's either building on a small lot or remodeling where they need a permit, how does that work for a very small lot? And like, what's the cost of something like that? And is that kind of within what something a homeowner can do? Because I think intent could be there, but there may not be enough space. And then I have one other question after.
Okay, so for your first question, we believe that the 25% is more doable than what the current is for based on sub area. So if you're using Talus as an example, that would be 75% canopy coverage. We haven't taken away the flexibility. So if you still couldn't hit that target, say it's 750 square feet was what you needed to hit. There's still options to plant off-site or pay into the tree fund, which then leads into your second question. So during permit review, if you have to do a fee in lieu for tree, pay into the tree fund, it is $1,000, and that covers the cost of the tree and some ongoing maintenance for that tree once, when it goes into the fund, and then it's distributed by parks to plant trees in other areas of the city. So it should be able to cover the cost of maintaining that tree as well while it's young and starting to grow.
Okay, so $1,000. It's not like tens of thousands of dollars to someone. Okay, and then the one last thing, and I'll turn my mic off, is we kind of jumped to some of the specifics, but I'd love your thoughts on. There's a goal of having canopy over sidewalks. And having it more livable and walkable city. So having tree canopies, these are not necessarily on people's property, but on parkways or on other public lands that cover sidewalks. And what's the thought of tree canopies for cooling the city versus on property? And I think we're only talking about on property, so I think I'd love to hear some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll get started and then I'm going to have Dan jump in because that's going to be more of his expertise with the urban forest management plan. So we discuss on private property for the tree code is because we just regulate within the boundaries of a property. So things that are in the right of way, those standards are regulated differently and not necessarily in the land use code. So I'll let Dan jump in and kind of discuss what his urban forest management plan has to say for, right of way trees, street trees, things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, great question. So our urban forest management plan does look at essentially heat disparity and kind of variability across the city. So there's actually some really good resources out on that. American Forest is a great national nonprofit that does this work across the country, kind of modeling some of that, as well as locally here, King County's been doing a lot of studies on urban heat island effects and where that's most pronounced in the county. So there's some good resources, like I said, nationally. Most of them are done by census blocks, so they don't perfectly line up with our sub-area definitions in the city, but they're pretty close. So you do see, and this is something, Doug or Steven, I'd be happy to send out to the commission afterwards if that would be helpful. But you do see some variations of, especially kind of in central Issaquah, along Gilman, getting into the highlands a little bit, north Issaquah, of, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than what would be in a, kind of non-developed state. So essentially, we've identified these areas, which I think all of us to some extent could do without a report necessarily, just based on the amount of pavement and just kind of walking through some of those areas on our hot days in the summer. But we do have those areas identified. We do have those areas marked as priorities for, as Stacy mentioned, our tree giveaway. As much as we can do that on private property in those areas, we're going to try to prioritize both the outreach and the offering of trees, at least a percentage of them, to some of those census block areas that have those biggest heat disparities. And then from our efforts, whether that's, funds coming from the tree fund or other park initiatives for tree planting, really prioritize those census block or neighborhood areas for, shade and cover. So yeah, really thinking about the goal in those areas. And obviously we have a lot of environmental, salmon recovery, water quality goals as we get into our, bigger open spaces and areas along the creek. So it's certainly, kind of customizing to, the needs in those areas. And yeah, like I said, central Issaquah, a little bit of Old Town, a little bit of North Issaquah, kind of around Lakeside. Those are the areas we see some of the higher heat disparities in the city. So that's essentially kind of how we're planning our efforts, or how we're prioritizing some of our tree planting initiatives moving forward with that information.
Thanks, Dan.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you both. Moving on, Katya, Commissioner Zakharov, do you have anything you'd like to ask? All right, Commissioner Matthews?
I did have a couple of questions. The first is, would you change the numbers? You changed the approach for how you calculate the numbers. I noticed that Tiger Mountain was originally 91% and now it's 85%. Can you tell me what made that decision, why it was changed down instead of maintained at 81%? 91, I'm sorry.
Well, we went differently with the canopy coverage targets as proposed. So yes, originally it was 91%. Now it's going based on what the land use is instead of it just being within the sub area. And in Tiger Mountain, there's a lot of tree coverage already. So if it's a single family lot in Tiger Mountain neighborhood, it would follow the canopy coverage requirements based on the lot size. So it can be anywhere, depending on the lot size, from 35 to 60%. But we're still trying to hit that target for the Tiger Mountain sub area. We're just not putting the burden of 91% on each of the individual lots that are within that sub area.
Okay, because actually in the zone, it actually looks like Tiger Mountain is pretty much just the forested hiking area, no neighborhoods included, when you look at the zoning map, so that's why I was a little
Yeah.
confused. We're out of the sub-area, and now just looking at the mountain itself.
Yeah, because we're looking at the individual lot instead of taking the entire sub area and then implementing that target onto each of the individual lots.
I'm still a little bit confused about that one. I wonder if you could take
Okay.
it, and just take a look, because it's supposed to be by zone, and when you look at the zone, under, right. It doesn't look like there's homes in that zone at all. Just
Yeah,
the,
that would be like a conservancy zone probably.
yeah, it's in a conservancy zone, and the numbers did change, so that's why I was just curious.
Okay.
My second question, it actually may not be able to be covered under this, but in some cases where you can't meet that 25% target in the central area, is it possible to have an alternative for like green roofs, which is something that we don't really do in the US that much, but it's basically up and coming in Europe, because it does help with the heat zones that people have been concerned about, because that is a huge concern once we start building up the central area, is that we're not going to get relief. It's going to get warmer. So maybe that's an option that could be, I mean, it affects a lot of things like building code and everything else, but I didn't know if that was actually an option that was being considered at all.
Yes and no. It's been talked about, and it would be allowed if a building in Central wanted to do some sort of green roof. We don't have any, like, there are no standards that prevent that from happening. We never really looked at it as like, as a way to capture canopy. Not sure how large of a tree you could get on a roof, without really affecting like how the building is constructed and structural engineering and stuff. But I know it can happen, and I mean, that's something that we can continue to explore and consider. If the tree large enough, that might be able to help you with your canopy coverage.
I actually think I might not have asked my question properly, but it was like, rather than having to meet the canopy standards, if they could alternate and do a, kind of like we were talking about with impervious surfaces, there's no buildable, but actually not having to provide the canopy, but actually do like a green roof instead to help, so an alternate to the canopy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Dan's got his hand up, so I'm going to let him.
Oh, you're muted, Dan.
Add to your second question, but I can add a little more context to your first, maybe, Doug, since I have some of these documents open. But a lot of our guidance is coming from a 2019 report, which is our first comprehensive tree canopy analysis across the city. It looked at our overall, whole square mileage of Issaquah tree canopy at 51%, and that's what helped, set this goal of 55% in our climate action plan. But within that report, it also looked at tree canopy by zoning and land use and by the sub areas. So to your question about Tiger Mountain, hopefully I can provide a little more clarity there. But Tiger Mountain as a sub area was identified at 91% cover in that 2019 study. But if you look at community conservancies across, essentially open spaces across the city, it was actually about a 75% tree cover. So Tiger Mountain's a little higher than maybe some other forested open spaces that might have more canopy gaps, invasive species, things like that. So I believe, Doug, if I don't have this open right now, but I believe it is across the city as a zoning use of community facilities at 85% now. So yes, for Tiger Mountain that comes down 6%, but across the entire city, based on the measurement, once again, it's a little out of date. These are things that we plan on updating ideally every 5 years, so we can kind of track success or if we're going backwards on tree canopy. But across the city, that was 74% measured in 2019, and now at 85%. So it's actually as a whole across the city coming up a bit, but compared to where Tiger Mountain itself is a slight decrease. So hopefully that clarifies that first question of yours a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Commissioner Olner.
Yeah, I had a question of clarification. So I know we're talking within the context of Title 18, which applies to private lots and private property. But the overall target of 55% canopy by 2035, does that include public lands or just the lands, the properties covered by Title 18?
Doug, if you, I can take that real quick. Doug, if you want me to, it is citywide, so it includes both private properties and public properties in city. And our park system is remarkably about 20% of our land cover in Issaquah, over 1,500 acres of open space, another few hundred acres of maintained parks and facilities. So to answer your question, it is citywide, and we are looking at tree planting goals that still prioritize most of that on public lands, but looking at these initiatives like these tree giveaways or incentive programs for canopy, both maintenance and care, and then new planting of trees to form new canopy on private property as well. So it is both.
Great, thank you. Just one other question, and that has to do with maintenance. So if a private property owner plants trees but doesn't maintain them, doesn't water them, doesn't trim them, does the city have any recourse, or how does that handled?
So right now, how it's being handled is we do an inspection once the tree has been planted. We don't really have any ongoing requirements for that if it's the individual property owner that has planted the tree. If they have paid into the tree fund and now this tree is planted on public property, then that tree would be maintained by park staff.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. And Commissioner Adair.
Hi, so I have kind of an umbrella question, which is when looking at the changes to Title 18 and I'm looking at the comment matrix, one of the comments from the city was it has been difficult to interpret and apply the current code equitably and consistency, which has led to applicant frustrations. Could we get some examples of a scenario? It doesn't have to be an exact person, but a scenario where someone is frustrated or they're not able to get what they need.
Yeah, no, to think I'm on the spot to some scenarios. I think the biggest one was the replacement requirements if you weren't meeting the individual canopy coverage requirements for your lots. That was frustrating for a lot of people who were just trying to remove a tree that may be hazardous, remove a single tree and then come back and like, well, you are deficient, 15% canopy coverage, so now you're going to have to plant X number of trees. That was frustrating. The scenarios where this was a small single family lot doing a small addition, removing no trees. They were also deficient, but their lot on two sides abutted green space. It was, protected along a creek, had significant canopy overhang from mature vegetation or mature trees that were there, and they couldn't capture that. So they planted some trees on their property and then also had to pay the remainder into the tree fund. Those were two examples where the property owner was fairly frustrated with our process.
Follow-up question then, how does changing from sub-areas to individual lot zoning help in those scenarios? I'm not quite seeing the connection.
So for a single family lot, instead of it just being sub-area, so, in some cases the canopy target for that sub-area might be incredibly high, 75% for talus, for instance, and you have a small lot, and you're not ever going to be able to meet that 75%. That tends to be probably the biggest headache. And since we deal mostly with, when it comes to tree removal permits, it's mostly single family residences that are doing it. And then in some instances, it's HOAs. And that's another frustration is HOAs having to apply for multiple permits because they have trees, they manage trees on multiple parcels within that HOA. So they have to submit a tree removal permit for each of those properties instead of just having some sort of one permit that could capture all of them. Did I help answer that first question? Because I can try to expand
Yeah, well,
on that.
so I understand the multi-permitting and everything. I guess I think what I'm confused by is the idea of the sub-areas moving to the individual lot zoning, because in a lot of cases, the single families percentages actually seem to increase, and it seemed to be that the commercial and retail and multifamily all decreased. So it does feel like the single families are bearing more of a burden for having that tree canopy than other groups.
You're correct in pointing that out. In some instances, that is the case. Where there's a relief from that is allowing overhanging canopy from an adjacent parcel or green space, right-of-way trees that extend onto the property to be able to capture that canopy as well. Whereas right now you're not able to capture that canopy as part of your site's overall canopy. I think of anything else, but yes, in some instances, your canopy for a single family will increase, not by much. At least from what we've been able to determine, it's not going to be by much, and in most cases it may remain the same or just slightly decrease because now we're taking the burden of the sub area off of that individual lot, and yeah. Dan.
Yeah, I'll add to that just a little bit, because I've worked with Talus a fair amount on type of these projects. We have a lot of city open space that abuts the Talus HOA, and yeah, exactly what Doug's describing. The fact that Talus, when we did this study in 2019, across the entire neighborhood or sub area was 75%, but that is highly inflated because there's also a lot of conservancies or native growth protection areas in there, about 100 or so acres. So, that probably has an 80-90% tree cover, which really drives up the rest of it. So that's where kind of merging the zonings and just averaging it across the sub area just didn't work. When you have this kind of neat history in Issaquah where we've set aside a lot of open space with these denser developments like Talus and Issaquah Highlands. So that was my read. Why that mostly didn't work is because a lot of these forest and open spaces were included in those sub areas, really inflated the tree canopy in those areas, like Talus, for example, at 75%. And to think that you're going to achieve that on a less than 10,000 square foot lot is nearly impossible to also have a home there. I would say to your next question about single family and kind of the responsibility there. There's definitely nuance to this, but in that same 2019 study, single family across the city was measured at 55% tree canopy. So for those larger lots, which I don't have it up right now, I think it's more than 15,000 square feet, that actually is going up a little bit to a 60% requirement, or at least as proposed as is right now. But then as you tier down to 10 to 15,000 feet or under 10,000, those are coming down. But it is hard to say with that 55% measurement in 2019, how much of that was from those larger properties versus smaller properties. We do not have that fine grain of data to tease that out. So these are kind of our best estimates and also kind of comparisons, as Doug mentioned earlier, to other cities that have similar tree canopy goals as it relates to zoning. So I think your point's well taken, but this is our best information based on what other cities are doing and based on the data we have, which does show that overall single family canopy at 55%, but that is a little harder to tease out how much of that is contributed from bigger lots versus smaller lots. But we're trying to tease that out as best we can.
Yeah, and to kind of clarify and articulate my concern a little better here, I am just concerned that the burden of this, the cost, maintaining a tree is really expensive, especially a conifer tree. Getting them pruned yearly is like $1,500, whatever. So putting that all on single families versus you have commercial and multifamily units which are being given options to have a much lower percentage of canopies, and they're giving options like, fee in lieu, et cetera. It doesn't really seem fair, right, if you're looking at it, especially if you're just thinking about cost distribution.
All right, let's see. Commissioner Millender-Irwin, do you have any questions or comments on this topic?
No, I don't. I think that staff has done a phenomenal job in clarifying this issue and answering some great questions tonight. So, no, thank you.
Got it. And Commissioner Moll wanted to give you an opportunity to speak at this time as well, if desired.
Okay, I already asked all of my questions previously.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Moll. Coming back around, everyone's had an opportunity. Does anyone have a follow-up question or comment? Go ahead, Commissioner Adair.
Hi again. Okay, so I also have a question about lot overhang. So my question is, if a property owner is allowed to remove trees and they still meet the canopy requirement, right? Like, let's say I have a 10,000 square foot lot and I have 45%, and that includes overhang trees on my neighbor's property, right? So then let's say my neighbor wants to remove some of their trees that include those canopy trees, right? Is the other lot owner who's now responsible to bring the site into compliance? Does that make sense? So like, let's, yeah.
Yes, that makes sense. First, let's start with like how our code is written, and we have not changed this in the proposal, is that a tree has to be it has to qualify for a tree removal. So if it's a healthy tree, unless it's causing physical damage to a structure or it has to be a hazard tree, dead, dying, diseased. So a healthy tree will more than likely not be removed. And if the neighbor removes that canopy that overhangs onto your property, the person responsible for that and that property owner would have to replace that tree. Now, they may be in a location that it isn't going to create that overhang anymore. But it would be when that adjacent property came in with a tree removal permit or some sort of development permit, maybe they're doing an addition, that's when we would do the calculations for the tree canopy coverage. And if they were less than what the canopy target is for that particular zone and lot size, they would have to plant a tree at that time to cover that canopy to get it back up to what it's supposed to be for the zone.
Excellent, thank you. And Commissioner Moll, I see you have a question at this time. Go ahead.
Yes, I am a bit confused. Are you saying that if you plant a tree on your property and it overhangs the neighbor's property, that you receive credit for the canopy when on somebody else's land?
The canopy that overhangs onto your property, because that's still canopy that's on your property. So you wouldn't get the full canopy, you wouldn't get full canopy credit for that tree that's on the adjacent property, but whatever the portion that overhangs would receive some credit for canopy for that.
I'm more thinking of the negative when you remove a portion of the canopy, because a property owner has the right to remove limbs that overhang. So I guess what I'm wondering is, are we blurring the lines of ownership here?
I don't think we're blurring the lines of ownership. If a property owner prunes the tree back that's on that overhangs on their property, they would not get the credit for that overhang because that canopy isn't overhanging their property.
Okay, but the person who planted the tree is getting some credit. Is that correct, or am I misinterpreting?
No, the person that planted the tree is getting the canopy that's on their property.
Okay, but not on the adjoining property.
No.
Okay, great.
No, yeah, so if like, say, 250 square feet of canopy extends onto the neighbor's property, you're not getting that 250 square feet on your property, just the portion that's captured within your property boundaries.
Okay, the reason that I'm bringing this up is as we continue to increase development density, we're going to run into more and more overhanging trees as they get larger. And I just wanted to make sure that there was some understanding for us. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, Doug.
Commissioner Matthews.
So I did have a question, that was actually one I was thinking about for a while, but I did have a question about the property-to-property overhangs. So say that the person got a 25% or whatever, that went to their 25% or whatever percentage it was on their property, but the neighbor decides to cut the overhang, and then this person now wants to get a permit to do some work on their home, and so when the canopy is now calculated, it doesn't meet the criteria. So what happens then? You have to actually pay into the tree fund at that time?
Let me see if I got I think I understand what you're saying. So you have two properties, two neighboring properties, tree canopy overhangs onto the neighbor's property. They cut that canopy back that overhangs their property and now come in for a development permit. Is that the scenario? Did I get that scenario correct?
Right. So, yeah, so it's the person who got the credit for the overhang.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because this could happen. Somebody decides they need to cut the tree or move that tree out, and now you want to redevelop your house or put a new siding on or a porch, and you go for a permit.
Mm-hmm.
Now you no longer meet that criteria that you used to meet, and that wasn't anything to do with you. Are you now having to go back and plant another tree to meet that? I think because it becomes muddied when you add overhang property to property. That's what I'm trying to say. It's gonna, in the future, somebody's gonna go, hey, it's not my fault he took his tree out. Why do I have to plant another tree? Or why do I have to pay into this tree fund?
Mm-hmm.
I could just see that happening. Does that make sense? Like, it's really complicated property to property.
Yeah. No, I see that and can see the complications, because what we were trying to achieve with that is just like trees don't necessarily follow our rules for property lines. So just looking at it as a whole instead of just with what's within, to capture everything within that neighborhood. And so to go back to the question that you were asking before, if the person had pruned back their tree and then the neighbor came in for a development permit and that canopy doesn't overhang, they would have to still meet the canopy targets for that, and may result in having to either plant a tree on site or off-site within the same sub-area, or pay into the tree fund.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, but I could just see that somebody's gonna be upset about it.
Bad
Now-
neighbors. It's like one of those,
Yeah, it was
yeah,
mine yesterday,
recipes
what's
for
today?
angry
Yeah,
neighbors.
So that's just something I thought would be, something to consider,
Okay.
as far as the language, the clarification goes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Commissioner Matthews. Commissioner Krass, real quick.
Hi, Commissioner Cross. You may or may not have covered this. So new construction, I get that, it would trigger the review of tree canopy. What level of remodel would trigger this type of analysis where the homeowner would have to do it? Like, would a deck do it? Is it a minor, like, if they do something, what type of building permit would actually call for this?
We look at compliance with the tree code with, pretty much most ground disturbing activities. So if you are constructing a deck, that would be something that could trigger review of the tree canopy. Obviously, tree removal is another one. Redevelopment is defined in our land use code as, I believe it's, now I'm blanking off the top of my head.
50% of
There's
the
a
King County
percentage of
assessed
the-
value.
Yeah, there's a I think it's 75% of the assessed King County improvement value, or it might be 50% for redevelopment.
So does that mean what, a deck?
A deck wouldn't trigger that unless
That-
you were building a really extravagant.
Okay, so it's not like someone's getting a plumbing permit, it doesn't trigger this?
Correct.
Anything inside home, but it has to be over 50% of the value of the land or the building portion, which is a pretty big remodel.
Yes.
So a small remodel
Yes.
would not trigger
It
this?
would be a pretty significant remodel
That-
or
that is-
major addition or something, but
Okay,
it has
that-
to meet that threshold. It's what we have defined.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you.
And in some cases where maybe the addition isn't that large, but results in the removal of a tree in order to accommodate that addition, then review of the canopy would be required at that point.
Gotcha. Commissioner Adair?
Hi, can you go into more depth on how fee in lieu works? Is it something, like, let's say I want to take down a tree and redevelop my lot, I'm meeting the requirements. Is there a process to do fee in lieu? Like, do I have to prove there's no alternative? Or can I just jump straight there and say, like, you know what, I don't want to add another tree. I'm just going to give you a $1,000 check. How does that work?
So we have kind of a hierarchy that we follow for that instance. And we go back to the example of the single family homeowner who planted some trees and then paid the rest into the tree fund. We follow that hierarchy, but it's not set to where, like, if you can't meet it, or there might be other circumstances, like us as staff will work with you in order for you to get to compliance with that. But it's not necessarily you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get to the next, like to plant off site in the same sub area, or then to plant into the tree fund. We just follow that hierarchy, but there aren't like jumps or like really specific standards that you have to hit in order to get to that pay into the tree fund. And then where we collect that money is during the permit review. We'll add that fee, and then the permit tech will invoice the applicant at that point. And then to receive your permit, you've got to pay for all of your permit fees, and that fee would be included in there, and then it gets deposited into an account.
And to provide a little clarity of part of what we're looking at is just potential planting areas on the site, but also looking at the survivability of where the potential planting areas are to help us determine and make that judgment on, that's not going to be a great area for trees that are likely not going to survive. So let's give you this option of the tree fee in lieu fund as an alternative.
So, and I'm just wondering what the guardrails are, though, in the opposite case. For example, like, we're assuming best case scenario, people have good intentions and they're just trying to do the best. But like, what if Jeff Bezos has a 10,000 square foot property and he wants to put a soccer field in and take out 100 trees? Can he write a check for $100,000 and get away with it? Or is there some kind of guardrail in place to keep that from happening?
The guardrail is that the lot would have to meet the canopy coverage, or you pay into the fee in lieu, but also for development such as that, you have tree retention requirements you also have to meet. So for single family lots, you would have to maintain 35% of the caliper inches that are on site. So there are other guardrails and other standards to use where you couldn't just clear cut your lot and then pay into the tree fund like $100,000 and then just walk away. There are other triggers in the tree code as well that, or other standards in the tree code that we would have to look at in a scenario such as that.
I've kind of a piggybacking question off of that. I believe in the old or previous method, there was no fee in lieu for the trees, and then we've now added that in. Is that correct? And if so, what was the kind of reasoning or catalyst for that?
Fee in lieu has been in our code from the 2023 update as a method. I mean, it was in our previous code as well. So this isn't, the tree code isn't, or the tree fund isn't new. We've now added more language in the recent update in 23 that identify the standards in place for what the tree fund can be used for, things like that. So we've added more robust language in the 23 updates, but we didn't really touch those in these proposed amendments.
Okay. Looking down the line. Commissioner Mole, do you have a question or comment?
No,
Okay.
you're not.
Looking around. All right. Excellent. Oh,
I have
Sure.
another question. Okay, what, and this might be in the code, how does a landmark tree become a nuisance tree? Can we talk about that? Because I did see that pop up in the amendment, and I'm curious.
Yeah. So a landmark tree can become a nuisance tree if it's causing obvious physical damage to a structure or has the potential to cause obvious physical damage. And I think that's the distinction that we made in these proposed amendments is the potential to cause. So you'd have to document, the tree is, the roots have like damaging the foundation of the home, and an arborist has evaluated it and said that there's nothing that they can do in order to stop the roots from damaging. There's nothing that they can do to the tree to save the tree and also protect the home or the structure itself. And then in that case, that would be classified as a nuisance tree. Or if the tree is growing into, has the potential, I'm trying to think of a scenario, all I'm thinking of is power lines or telephone lines or whatever. But they know that tree is just going to grow into it and cause problems. I guess that could be another scenario too.
Commissioner Allner.
I have a very minor question relating to cabling of trees, which I understand you're trying to affect a change in Title 18 to prohibit cabling of trees. I was just curious to know why that's no longer considered a good idea.
Maybe Dan has a more detailed explanation. I know that it's not best practice, but Dan might be able to speak to why it's not best practice anymore.
Yeah, it is still done in scenarios, but essentially the best practice is then requiring an engineer to be inspecting that every year or two. So it's not one of those things you just put the cabling in and be like, we're set, we can walk away from this. I mean, you're doing that in a situation with a tree that has at least some level of risk, and that's why you're trying to mitigate that risk with cabling or bracing. So I do know there's been a couple scenarios in the city where, unfortunately we've, whether that be on private or, public as well, where we've taken that approach and just having the expertise, keeping up with that. And, essentially, like I said, having those inspections is a very kind of specialized thing. We have a lot of engineers that work for the city, and, myself as an arborist, but I am not qualified to inspect, bracing and the materials and climbing trees and doing all that. So I think that's where it kind of has both just the follow up, with that type of approach to, trying to extend the life of trees, and some of the risk and liability that comes with that, I think is kind of my understanding is why we have kind of moved away from that. So, Doug, hopefully that's kind of in line with what you've heard too, but.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
All right, going once, going twice. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Doug and Dan, for being on tonight and answering all of our questions. I know we put you through your paces there, but you handled it amazingly. So thank you so much for the overview of information on the tree code. I understand we'll be able to talk more about this, I think, in about a month. So we look forward to revisiting this topic at that time.
Okay. Thank you, commissioners, and have a great, wonderful evening.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. All right, looking at the next item on the agenda, which is reports. City council updates. Stephen, is there any updates to share?
Yes, Vice Chair Patterson. Oh, for council update, on Monday night, City Council adopted the Title 18 clarifying amendments that the commission previously reviewed. They also adopted the amended shoreline master program that the commission held a public hearing on. And then they also, if you're interested, they looked at the preferred concept that was presented to council on the Squaw Mountain non-motorized project, if you're interested in learning more about that from Monday's council meeting. Otherwise, there's no other items going to council until May, which is going to be the middle housing regulations.
Excellent. And any other business or announcements?
None from staff.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order? Excellent. Well, then we will adjourn this meeting at 8:00 p.m. Thank you very much.